Good morning. My name is Wilfred Lee, and along with my partners Merritt Bjornlund, Liam Simpson, and Roberto Aponte, we hold that the United States must push back now against illegal Chinese expansion in the South China Sea. For the past 5 years, China has been expanding beyond general boundary norms in the South China Sea by using its comparatively stronger military to coerce its neighbors into accepting its new claims. While they argue that their land reclamation project is grounded in old history, we, and the rest of the international community, read China's actions as a legal opportunistic aggression for more resources and land. However, without a significant enough pushback against its claims, China currently has no reason to stop its aggressive behavior in the region. This past Tuesday, an international arbitration court in The Hague unanimously ruled that China has violated the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea Convention that it had signed by constructing artificial islands in Philippine territory. This landmark case indicates that all but China view its recent expansion as a violation of international law. There's no better time for United States action. Allowing Chinese expansion threatens both liberal international order, setting precedent for legally questionable revisionism in the rest of the world. The global community has now spoken its opinions on the matter and needs a leader to defend the free trade status quo. Rather than allow China to ignore international law and bolster its unchecked military growth, the United States must use its military and economic leverage now to deter this expansion for the sake of the global economy, our Asian Pacific allies and partners, and also to the United States itself. While some may endorse a strategy of trust and cooperation that effectively appeases China, this response lacks the enforcement power to actually deter them. Rather, China will continue to ignore international complaints as they are doing now, escalating regional tensions with countries such as the Philippines. With a greater reach in the Asia-Pacific through its coercive and intimidating measures, China also has the ability to weaken American alliances in the region. As it continues to intimidate countries such as Japan, our allies and partners will consider less of what is in America's interest in the future, but more so a stronger China's. We must provide teeth to this enforcement of this court ruling while America still has this significant leverage. We can avoid a dangerous future alternative of interacting with a more militarized China. Forcing their hand now is in the interest of the domestic and global economic market. It means greater political peace in the Pacific theater, and it is beneficial to the protection of international maritime rights and laws. As a result, we propose the following policies. 1. Work with regional allies such as Japan and the Philippines to build more capable facilities and training centers at bases in their territories. Doing so protects both our allies but also American interests within the South China Sea region. 2. Increase current naval fleet in the South China Sea by shifting carriers and warships currently departing from the Middle East, the African coast, and South America. These resources will be used for more frequent freedom of navigation operations and also prevent further Chinese aggression and expansion. And lastly, we would like to ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This document protects the economic and sovereignty rights at stake in this issue and legitimizes American efforts to enforce last week's ruling at The Hague. These policies make it clear that the United States is serious in deterring China's illegal violations. Note, we're not trying to doom China's economic fate. Rather, the long-term goal of our policies are to allow financial development in China, but also protect the norms of the international community. China is well aware, despite its nationalist ambitions driving expansion, that it has benefited a lot from the globalist and free trade-based economy today. In fact, its GDP has increased by an astounding 2,600% in the past quarter century because it has taken advantage of this exact economy. Their bountiful resource resources for them in the South China Sea, but China and its export-focused economy simply cannot afford to risk damaging its trade relationships with the United States and its regional partners. As a result, we'd like to further our overall strategy, and I'd like to turn it over to our regional specialist, Roberto Aponte. Thank you.
Thanks, Wilfred. The United States cannot afford to adopt a policy of passive restraint in the South China Sea. China has inflamed tensions with its neighbors, and in the process, it has destabilized the region, and it has openly violated international law. Decreasing tensions requires more than cooperations of trust and diplomacy based on code of conduct. It requires that the United States must act firmly to deter China, relying on both its military superiority in the Asia-Pacific region and the backing of the international community, which is made clear that we have it given the recent ruling in favor of the Philippines. If we let China expand its military presence in the South China Sea undeterred, weaker nations might be inclined to appease a stronger China. Stronger nations, such as Japan, might assume their own defensive responsibilities, potentially accelerating militarism, not alleviating it, and even potentially nuclear proliferation in the region. Furthermore, international law is universal in its application, and China's challenge to it may set a precedent for other revisionist states to make similar challenges in other parts of the world. Any of these developments will come at the expense of U.S. influence and power projecting capabilities in the region. China's opportunistic campaign of aggression is not fueled by U.S. presence in the region, quite the contrary. It is fueled by Southeast Asian nations' relative weaknesses and American reluctance to play a bigger role in the conflict. U.S. policy should thus be geared towards deterring China's opportunistic aggression, preventing it from coercing its neighbors, and strengthening our partners and allies. The recent decision from the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruling in favor of the Philippines signals that the U.S. has the backing of most of the international community. The U.S. should take advantage of this ruling by calling for all parties to heed it and to obey international law. If China ignores the ruling, it would damage China's international standing and influence. This, of course, paves the way for increased American involvement in the region, most likely at the behest of our regional allies, which would only further hamper Chinese efforts at expanding their exclusive economic zone. The U.S., as leader of the international order, must take the initiative to pressure China to abide by international law. While there is no international mechanism to enforce the ruling, U.S. pressure in the region could seek to further the same ends. That is why we are proposing to back our diplomatic pressure with military muscle. This is not a quixotic effort. There is a plausible, if not guaranteed, scenario in which China buckles down to international pressure. The rationale behind China's foreign policy is opportunistic expansion. China has tended, in the context of the South China Sea, to seize the initiative when it views it has an opportunity, and it hasn't tended to push ahead when it meets opposition. More specifically, in early 2010, parties involved in territorial disputes expressed concern over China's increased aggressive actions. This sequence of events culminated in June 2010 when then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, during a meeting of ASEAN in Hanoi, expressed the South China Sea to be an area of critical American interests. This, of course, signals a greater degree of American involvement in the region, and China was forced to moderate its own behavior. And then in 2011, China culminated in an agreement with Vietnam to sort of lay out maritime conducts and certain territorial disputes. In 2011, it reached an agreement with Vietnam over basic principles for resolving maritime issues through international law. This is evidence that, at least temporarily, increased U.S. leadership has pressured China into moderating its behavior. Therefore, by supporting the ruling without abandoning its official position of neutrality, the U.S. challenges Chinese claims and forces China to make a choice between ignoring the ruling, which would further isolate it from the international community, or abiding by the rules of the international order. With China due to host the G20 summit in September, it will face external pressure to moderate its behavior and avoid escalatory measures. But code of conduct and diplomacy based on trust and cooperation only go so far. You must complement diplomatic pressure with, as I said, military muscle. There is no guarantee that China will moderate its behavior due to the international pressure. Indeed, this is not the first time that China has openly violated international law. And given the nationalistic leanings of Xi Jinping's government, it is not hard to be skeptical of China's willingness to accept the ruling. This does not mean that the US should appease China. We have the backing of the international community with us, which means we're in an advantageous position to enforce our ruling with military escalation. If China chooses to double down on its adventurism, the US must be prepared to counter these measures, both by exercising its military advantage and by strengthening our relationships with allies and partners such as the Philippines and Vietnam. The alternatives are to appease China or to sanction China's actions, which would serve to escalate conflict and be in the interest of neither party. To deter Chinese aggression and military activism, the US must strengthen its relationship with regional actors. As part of Obama's pivot to Asia, America is providing increased military aid to the Philippines designed to modernize its army and navy. This involves, going back into what used to be old US military bases, as well as sending more military aid to modernize the Philippine Navy. Though not formally an ally, Vietnam is also an important partner in the conflict against China. Renewed sales of lethal weapons to Vietnam, which President Obama announced a couple of months ago, is the first step in strengthening American-Vietnamese relations. Vietnam's government, pressed by an ever more powerful China, knows it cannot stand up to Beijing alone and is cautiously moving toward increased ties with the United States. Key to this relationship is an American presence in Cam Ranh Bay, a naval port in Vietnam, which would allow the United States forces to use the port on the western edge of the South China Sea, complementing American facilities in the Philippines on the sea's eastern edge. If the United States can get regular access to this port, it would be very advantageous to maintaining the balance of power with China. It would also be a useful site for increased cooperation with other maritime powers in the area, such as Australia and Japan. Tokyo is cooperating closely with Washington and Canberra in a coordinated effort to strengthen ASEAN's defense and security capabilities. Australia has strengthened bilateral defense cooperation with the Philippines as well, and is prepared to support America and Japan's platforms to contribute to the hardening of the Philippines' defense capabilities. And now I leave you with Liam Simpson to handle the economic dynamics of the region.
Thank you, Roberto. While Team A might purport China's actions to be largely defensive and born out of insecurity, we believe their motivation is more offensive. An area with tremendous reserves of oil and a crucial corridor for trade, the South China Sea is a region of the world steeped in economic interest and potential. Naturally, much of China's activity in the region can be explained through the language of economic gain. Control over the vast oil and natural gas reserves contained below the water, and most importantly, the vital trade routes that traverse the sea, pose significant economic threats to our interests. If we, the United States, accept our position as an enforcer of liberal cooperation and free trade, a promoter of a global system governed by international law, then we cannot simultaneously allow China's actions in the South China Sea to go on. While conflict in the region has occurred since World War II, there has generally been an economic status quo in the South China Sea that has been governed by this liberal world order. The established norms of freedom of navigation have allowed trillions of dollars to pass through the sea uninhibited, and the vital resources of the region have not yet been monopolized by one powerful country. However, China's opportunistic aggression to gain military power, economic resources, and control over regional trade seek to undermine this order, an order that ironically has benefited China enormously over the past quarter decade. There are a number of economic reasons that the United States should be concerned with China's actions in the South China Sea. For one, the area is reported to contain more oil reserves than any region of the globe outside of Saudi Arabia. This is incredibly important to China as they are still heavily dependent on oil, and Middle Eastern oil at that. Furthermore, a full 10% of fish caught globally are caught in the South China Sea, important given the fact that many coastal communities in neighboring Philippines and Vietnam rely almost entirely on fishing for their economy. It is our position that China's actions can in part be explained by a desire to control these valuable and heavily disputed resources, a goal that is in direct conflict with international law and the word of international courts. However, perhaps the most important economic aspect of the South China Sea dispute is the fact that a full $5.3 trillion worth of trade passes through the South China Sea, which includes 2/3 of South Korea's energy supplies, 60% of Japan and Taiwan's, and $1.2 trillion of American imports and exports, not to mention 80% of Chinese crude oil and billions of dollars of their own trade. Chinese control over the South China Sea, an attempt to gain more exclusive benefits over regional trade, would disrupt the liberal order in which this trade has been allowed to traverse the waters freely. We cannot trust China to be benevolent with respect to trade passing through waters it controls, especially when the trade is that of its competitors in the political and economic sphere, such as Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, and yes, the United States. Even if China does not directly restrict the passage of trade, shipping through waters governed by Beijing and not international law is riskier and thus more expensive due to insurance rates charged to shipping companies. China's actions can be explained by the henceforth unchallenged opportunity they see to gain possession of the disputed resources, as well as control over regional trade to further their own interests. Our strategy of an increased military presence in the South China Sea will not lead to uninhibited escalation, in part because of the enormous economic leverage we hold over China. While it is true that our cooperative trade relationship is enormously important to both countries, and our imports and exports to each other are roughly matched, we must keep in mind that China is primarily an export-based economy, and thus its trade with us accounts for a much larger portion of its GDP, a full 80% more than it does for us. Allow me to clarify. Yes, the leverage works both ways. While less important to us comparatively, we do not by any means wish to lose our cooperative relationship with China. However, by positioning our military in a stance of deterrence, we put the onus on China to react, almost certainly by backing down. Our economic leverage merely acts as a support and base for our actions, a failsafe against Chinese escalation and further aggression. Furthermore, it is clear that were a full-scale trade war to commence, which is highly unlikely, many, if not most of the Southeast Asian countries we seek to defend would align with us, meaning that China might risk losing nearly $1 trillion of additional trade. The United States, therefore, considering only its economic strength, not to mention that of its military, is in a position such that China would be very unwise to challenge our demands. However, as a last resort, if China, against all odds, decides to ignore our demands and increase military presence, we are prepared to leverage specific economic sanctions against them. While this is risky, there are historical precedents that prove there are ways we could do this effectively and would not be immediately catastrophic in an economic sense. During the 1989 pro-democracy uprising, culminated by the Tiananmen Square massacre, the United States suspended arms trade, military exchanges, and support in international financial institutions to China. Rather than escalating tensions, our actions arguably led to an increase in Chinese cooperation in the liberal political sphere and the modernization of its government. One of the most promising, yet also most severe of the ways our sanctions could materialize would be a blockade on Middle Eastern oil being shipped to China. As previously mentioned, China depends heavily on Middle Eastern oil. These sanctions, as a last result, would be meant to be utilized in conjunction with other military and political efforts, and they would not stand on their own. In conclusion, while we do not seek to endanger our important relationship with China, the economic risks of a Chinese hegemony over the South China Sea are such that we must mobilize our economic leverage to get China to back off its claims in the region. Our strategy will convey the message to China that it is economically better off as a player in the liberal economic system. To discuss the specificities of the military situation in our strategy, I'd like to introduce our military specialist, Merritt Bjornlund.
Thank you, Liam. In order to contain China's opportunistic, escalating aggression in the South China Sea, we need to bolster U.S. military presence in the area and defend freedom of navigation, as well as to ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It is imperative that we act on this urgently. China is modernizing its military and becoming more belligerent in its violation of international laws and norms. Its vocal rejection of the ruling in The Hague violates the Law of the Sea Treaty and undermines the country as a good faith member of the international order. The violation of the Permanent Court of Arbitration's decision is unacceptable, and we must respond. It will only become harder for the US to contain China if it's left unchecked now. In other words, we can't let China become another Putin. If its coercive tactics are successful in the South China Sea, China could move on to more aggressive revisionism, threatening our Japanese allies' interests in the East China Sea, intimidating South Korea, or using more coercion against Taiwan. Cooperative security is impossible unless we all play by the same rules. By not taking action, we would enable even more illegal Chinese expansion, which is a fundamental threat to our rules-based international system. China's officially announced defense spending grew at an inflation-adjusted average of 9.8% from 2006 to 2015, up to $144 billion last year. And this number does not even include research and development or foreign weapons purchases, which would bring military spending to over $180 billion US, according to DoD estimates. China has been using this new might to intimidate its neighbors in the South China Sea and to back up illegal claims on disputed islands, even as it builds new artificial islands with both military and civilian bases in order to claim more maritime rights. Chinese officials reject third-party arbitration on its South China Sea issues, favoring bilateral negotiations because their neighbors are much weaker militarily and smaller economically, making them subject to intimidation that will only get worse as China projects more power. China is carefully pushing the boundaries of the US-supported world order while trying to avoid provoking direct conflict, or at least to make any opponent appear the more aggressive. The Department of Defense's most recent China report calls the strategy low-intensity coercion. Other scholars refer to it as the salami slicer strategy, in which China forces its adversary to take the disruptive action. With this heightened aggression, the Pentagon is particularly concerned about China's increasing anti-ship ballistic missile capability and about capabilities that could reduce core U.S. military technology advantages in ships, weapons, cyber warfare, and more. By acting now, we can maintain our credibility as protectors of the rules-based international system and use our existing military leverage to pressure China into following international law. Further, reassuring regional actors against Chinese security threats could even help prevent nuclear proliferation. Deterring China while we still have a military advantage is the best way to decrease the likelihood of a future war and to avoid more harmful consequences to the region. Our military policy proposal involves bolstering our naval presence on the South China Sea. We will increase our naval fleet by moving an aircraft carrier and destroyers from the Middle East and several warships each from the coasts of Africa and of South America. Since we are moving existing resources, the cost of this will be low. We will also continue the Obama administration's recent policy of supporting the Philippine military, as Roberto mentioned, which includes building American facilities at 5 Philippine bases and sending equipment and other military aid to protect our allies and our own interests in the region. Note that this strategy is critical to President Obama's pivot to Asia. As we wind down our resource-intensive ground operations in the Middle East, we can rebalance our priorities and refocus our attention toward a carefully designed military presence in the Asia-Pacific, helping to maintain the stability in a region that is economically and politically critical. The presence of our ships and our ongoing support for the Philippines, a victim of Chinese aggression, will substantiate our position that China's South China Sea expansion is illegal and pressure China to back down. We can use these new military resources for patrols that enforce international law. These patrols will include regular maritime freedom of navigation operations and air surveillance recon missions. Freedom of navigation trips should include military operations within the 12-mile radius of purported sovereignty around China's artificial islands, unlike previous patrols that simply exercise rights of innocent passage around those islands. These patrols, which can be authorized by the White House, will thus unambiguously reject the Chinese claim on sovereignty to those areas and help prevent China from using its anti-access area denial capabilities, as well as from doing more destructive and illegal construction. Finally, we recommend ratifying the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, the framework that China has ratified and is now willfully violating. Ratifying may be largely a symbolic gesture, as we have been de facto enforcing the treaty already, but it is an important step in fully committing ourselves to the same rules that we enforce. The Convention codifies the economic and political rights that we need to defend. By acting now to protect freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, we are the free trade status quo against Chinese overreach, allowing China and all its neighbors to access the sea fairly. Ultimately, we want to allow China to prosper, but will work to guide it away from the aggression that threatens our interests and the interests of the rest of the region and the world. By displaying our commitment to our allies and to our security interests, we avoid appeasing a growing China, we prevent escalating aggression without using violence, and we help create a world where we all share the resources of and access to the South China Sea according to internationally recognized rules. Now, we'll return to Wilfred to conclude our presentation.
By providing the military might to help enforce the international world order, the United States can use its influence to put an end to China's coercive aggression in the South China Sea. If we were to refuse to act now, conflicts and disputes will only escalate in the region. Waiting to act only makes it more difficult for the United States to respond in the future. Now is better than later, because a future uninhibited China would be even stronger militarily, with a greater power projection and area denial capabilities in the region. Ratification of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and an increase of American naval presence in the South China Sea does not provoke China, but rather deters them from illegal opportunism. The resulting effect of such benefits is for the United States the maintenance of American influence in the Asia-Pacific and also greater peace in the region. Tremendous Chinese dependence on the global economy ensures that even after these policies, U.S.-China trade relationship is still very stable and strong. We advise the United States to act now because of its own interests, that of its Asian Pacific allies and partners, and also for the sake of the entire global community. Thank you.
Okay, who'd like to start questions for China Team B? Go.
The first thing is an observation that you should disabuse me of if I'm wrong, but it seems like your ends are the same as Team A. Ratify the law of the sea, rules-based order, peace and trade. Is this really just a debate about means? So take that one, Wilfred.
Thank you. So to address that, I think the means are very different in the sense where I think the main disagreement is about the intent of Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, whereas Team A purports that China is acting as a defensive mechanism. We see it more as, again, an opportunistic opening where they see that no one's really trying to effectively push them back, that they're going to keep on pushing their boundaries. And as a result, I think it's not necessarily a different means. It's more so an idea of idealism and realism where we can go on these forums and trust and hope in these things. But we must also realize that, for example, the greatest evidence of Chinese reaction to this entire issue is its vocal rejection of the ruling at The Hague, that as a result, we can't just expect them to cooperate with us, but we must act with realism. And I think that is also a principal difference.
Okay, two more questions, one for Liam, one for Merritt. Liam, after World War II, U.S. policy planning had this sort of ruthless geopolitical logic, and it structured the world we now live in. So I'm just going to focus on two parts of Kennan's famous analysis, where he said we need to reestablish a world economy so the goods of our economy and our allies' economies will have outlets, but also we need to keep Japan and Western Europe out of the Soviet orbit. We would prefer to have them in our orbit, but if other things equal, they have to be neutral, then they maybe could be neutral. It seems to me these assumptions still undergird U.S. policy and still undergird your policy prescriptions and your analysis here. But are these just outdated assumptions? China isn't communist. China is capitalist. We don't have to protect the markets of the world to make sure that goods will flow freely. So note the incentives that are asymmetric about impeding traffic on the South China Sea. Actually, China has better incentives than the United States to keep trade flowing than the United States does. And notice that even if you give all the resources of the South China Sea to China, it won't change the distribution of power, the pecking order. The international pecking order will basically stay the same. So my question for Liam, just to bottle this down to a point, why is the South China Sea now different than Panama in 1900? As Britain passed it off to the United States, they had the same concerns we have now. What if we cut it off? What if we damage world trade? And it's like, why would we? We have the same interests you do. And for Merritt, you make the point that deterrence now will stop war later. And that could be true, but keep in mind China's strategy to this point has been to keep its head down and bide its time. And that could be because it doesn't have any problems, or it could be because when it's stronger, it's going to do what it wants to do anyway. So what about deterring now will stop war later? If they want war later, they just keep their heads down and get it. Well, how does your strategy stop that? And if they don't want war later and then we try to deter someone who doesn't need deterring, China has a long track record of noting a century of humiliation and not forgetting it and bringing it up. So there's a risk of escalating problems that shouldn't happen. And even if you try and stop them, you could be actually making it worse later. Take them in whatever order you like.
So, thank you for your question. My answer to that would be, so China has these pretty vocal and long-held nationalist tendencies, where more so than most other countries in that Pacific theater and globally, they feel that a key to their success is sort of actively suppressing the economies of their competitors, kind of actively like bolstering their own power in a somewhat non-cooperative way. The way that it differs from Panama in 1900 is America. There was no belief that America might restrict the passage of certain goods going through the Panama Canal just because it felt that those goods were going to a competitor of it. I mean, obviously, China recently has been a player in this kind of liberal cooperative economic sphere. It's kind of almost gone back against these long-held nationalist tendencies, but they still exist. And I think complete control over the South China Sea, we risk them just kind of making a hard turn back to their kind of core beliefs that maybe they're going to interfere with the energy supplies, as I mentioned, going to South Korea and Japan, or maybe I guess my main point was that we just can't really expect benevolence on their part. We can't expect them to just while they do seek to benefit from trade in the region, that hasn't been historically conducive to their nationalist policy.
Thank you for the question. It's definitely an important point to think about China's intentions in terms of like whether it values peace as much as the United States does. But I think that the way we conceptualize China is that it does have a lot to gain from the international order, so it's not going to start a war at the drop of a hat, but it sees this opportunity for expansion in the South China Sea. And our position is that a military deterrence strategy is not creating an escalatory situation, but actually preventing escalation. So regardless of like whether China wants a war or not, if we deter them now and we make it clear now that they need to stay within the rules that we've all agreed to, then we prevent a security dilemma in terms of insecurity in all the different countries on the South China Sea, in which they would be militarizing more, maybe heading more towards like a wartime scenario. And also we prevent Chinese expansion, like I said, more coercion against not just the Philippines, but against Taiwan or against South Korea. And all those scenarios would make any future war so much worse. China would have more power. It would have been enabled to expand more geographically, militarily. And so I think that's my answer to your question, is that a future war would be in many ways worse and more encompassing of more players in the region if we left China now.
Great, thank you. My first question is an overarching question of strategy, just a different way to think about things. Wilfred, you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that the U.S. has a tremendous amount of military and economic leverage over China. And I would push you to think about the political leverage as well, in the form of America's alliance system in the Asia Pacific. And often, and I think both groups have attested to this, we tend to think of U.S. alliances as relatively burdensome. We have to defend them, we have to reassure our allies. And I think one of the advantages the U.S. has over China is this vast political alliance system. So what are a few points you can give for how the United States can use this alliance system to our advantage vis-a-vis China in the region? And then second, more specifically, this could be a question for Roberto, but anyone feel free to take it. A few days ago, China announced that it would begin conducting air patrols over the South China Sea and the disputed islands following the ruling of the International Tribunal. And so here we are in a situation where we do have a strong military presence. We have this international ruling on our side, so we have the backing of the international community, and yet we do see China continuing to ignore and really take even more escalatory measures, such as the air patrols. So we've talked a lot about signaling. What would your tactical signaling response be in order to show strong resolve without reaching any sort of further escalation?
To address the leadership question, as is with general leadership, we agree that there are a lot of difficulties and responsibilities added on for being a world leader. However, because the United States is arguably the sole world leader today in this liberal international order, it also has the benefit of being able to share its overall vision with the rest of the world, where if we were to allow for China to get a greater grasp in the region. One downfall is that within the alliance system in the South China Sea, there would be more conflicting views on, I guess, how the world should work, how the region should be run. And I think that that comes at a great cost to the United States, who has a great economic but also political cost to that. So I think, to answer your question, the overarching thing is that while there are a lot of burdens to maintaining this alliance system, doing so helps us maintain this, I guess, stake in the world position as a leader who is allowed to have this vision to push and encourage towards the rest of the world.
I think just a really quick point, just to push even further on that, I mean, what are the interests, America's interests, how are they forwarded by these alliances we have with the Philippines and Japan outside of this kind of broader vision and maintaining what's at stake there? I mean, clearly we're not just signing these very powerful alliances for the sake of defending others. I mean, what's an interest there that we see forwarded by these alliances?
Sir, could you restate the question?
Actually, let's keep it brief, because I
Keep
have a
going.
couple more
We can move on
questions
to
I
the
want to
next
get to, Tori.
Yeah,
That's all
we
right?
want to move on to the next one about
Yeah.
counterattactics.
The air patrols that China announced recently are a show of strength. Nobody expected China to immediately capitulate to the ruling. Our strategy is to give time for China to save face, especially Xi Jinping. He's facing pressure from his own government to do something about that. But at the end of the day, there's going to be significant pressure, especially with the G20 summit coming on, to come to the table. But as I said, we need to prepare for every situation, and we're going to back it up with military muscle. But yeah, I guess my answer to the question is it is a show of strength. It is not unexpected. It is not surprising that they would do that. And yeah.
If I could add to that briefly, I mean, I think we should be wary of conflating current Chinese actions of escalation to what would happen if our policies were implemented. Because I mean, while we have been increasing our military presence, we haven't taken the formal stance that we are suggesting. Really aligning ourselves with the international community and further increasing our military presence. So I see where you're coming from, where it's sort of like, this tribunal ruling came out, yet they're still flying planes over these islands. I think our policy, our presence in the area, and our stated adherence to international law would have a different effect.
So I have a question that follows directly on that, which is great. So you guys have kind of where the rubber meets the road of the theory of deterrence here, right? And you say, China's likely to back down in response to the various policies you're laying out. So my question is, when you're talking about escalation dominance, you only have escalation dominance if you're willing to go to the highest rung of the ladder. And so certainly the United States military is stronger than China's military. But in many of these disputes, they're existential issues for the Chinese and not for the United States. So one of the questions I have for you guys is, are you or are the American people willing to fight a war with China over Vietnam? Are you willing to fight a war with China over the Philippines? Because if you're not, you don't necessarily have escalation dominance against China. You might have the capability to defeat them in an all-out war. But if you're not willing to go to that level, and China is, then you really risk putting U.S. credibility on the line in a way you're not willing to back it up. So I'm interested to know how you think about that, to what extent you think the American people are willing to make these enhanced commitments to what weren't longtime U.S. allies, and how does that factor into your policy prescriptions?
What I would say to that, I guess I might push back a little bit on your claim that the situation in the South China Sea is existential to China. Team A admitted themselves that China is probably not willing to go to war over the South China Sea, which I would agree with. I guess my main argument is that China is like us in that we're more valuable to them than the South China Sea. While the South China Sea might be more valuable to them than it is for us, they have so much to lose in terms of being a player in the international system that I don't know. I guess I don't quite have an answer to your question of what if they really do challenge us to go to full-scale war over that, other than I'm not confident in its likelihood.
I would also question whether the Chinese will is really there to go into an all-out war. I think China is struggling with nationalism at home and everything, but I don't think that the Communist Party is going to want to start a war. It doesn't seem like that's necessarily going to help them stay in power, and China has more interest, in the opinion of our group, in staying within an international system. That's why they're using a low-intensity coercion strategy. They're not trying to provoke a war. They're trying to push as far as they can within the rules they've been given and within the system they have. So I would say that China does not have the will to go to war either. They're trying to work within the system to get as much as they can without provoking that.
To add a last point to that.
Actually, Wilfred, I want to turn to Chris, and then last question, and we'll move on.
Well, first, just a point for future analysts. Since Clausewitz, we often think about strategy in terms of ends, ways, and means, end state, and the way that we approach this. And we've got a hawkish and dovish approach, and then the means are some of the specific points in the sequencing of that. I generally agree with Joe. I saw a lot of similarity in these courses of action in terms of the end states, in terms of deterring Chinese aggression, keeping them within international law. Perhaps I saw a little bit more in terms of hoping for a transformative effect in this strategic course of action presented over here. But and then one other point I would say is that implementation strategy would also be a key piece we'd need to hear from you. So you've got some means here. So would the president then, would we, for example, be communicating this to the world, this change? Or would we just expect their intelligence agencies to pick up on these changes? And I would think that you would probably be recommending actually rhetoric, that the president would be expressing this, because the point is we're actually trying to reinforce deterrence. The question I have is, as I think through courses of action, of course, we think about the strategic interplay, which is really some of the most important work that needs to be done. And, my concern is, given the fact that there is a lot of overlap in terms of what you're trying to achieve in an end state, is with this course of action that's presented here with Team B, what happens, Liam, if China decides, when they see this course of action, and they decide, well, we're not going to buy U.S. debt anymore? What happens to us then?
I think that would be a huge hit to us, and there's no denying that in a worst case scenario type of thing, that would not be not bad for us. But I guess I would argue that we do have more to lose in not backing up and enforcing the liberal order than we do in that scenario. So, I mean, there's no denying that either policy could go south. And in that situation, I think we would, we'd have to resort to all sorts of solutions, diplomacy, possibly, as I mentioned, sanctions of our own against China. But I mean, I think our number one priority is preserving the trade, the safety of trade in the region, and as we mentioned, this broad idea of some liberal international order that China is pushing against. So,
well, I definitely think you make a strong presentation of facts and analysis. There's no doubt about that. These are just some of the questions that decision makers have to grapple with. Right. One is, I mean, because we are in a weak situation fiscally, that really, it bears on the problem. Because if we can't get anybody to buy our debt, then we have to make it more attractive, which means we have to raise our interest rates. Now we're and see, China knows this. And so if we end up in a debt spiral, then we're significantly weakened economically. And related are just the markets, how the markets, the Asian markets, and then the impacts on the European and US markets, all of these things would bear on the problem. If we end up in another significant recession, and if the world goes into significant recession, this reorders all of these matters. That has to be at least taken into consideration. I mean, that's part of the challenge. And then I want to also say that of all your means that you were considering, that blockade is the most significant. I mean, that's cause. I mean, in the international court, that's cause for war. So that is very escalatory. I'm not ruling it out. I'm just saying that has to be very seriously considered, and then looking at the iterative strategic impacts of that.
Yeah.
To borrow Professor Krause's use of the term existential threat, I think the United States actually can use this to our advantage in negotiation with China in this case, where, for example, they're counteracting with a threat of no longer buying American debt, because the fact of the matter is Xi Jinping and the Communist Party would rather have control of China and would rather have an existential status quo in which it still rules the country. China still is strong and also takes in this route of which it has in which it stops its expansion in the South China Sea but remains the ruling party. Whereas if they were allowed this almost kamikaze economic reaction, where they're willing to take themselves out for the loss of a large United States recession and a global recession, we can weigh those two things. And realistically, I would just posit that I don't think China is willing to ever do that. And as a result, while it may be the case that China is going to threaten this, they're also going to be hurt in a sense where the Communist Party likely would no longer exist in this situation.
Okay, I'd like to thank China Team B.